I'd like to ask you to take your seats now. We don't have that much time, as seems to be always the case in our lives, doesn't it?
Please take your seat. Und vielen Dank dafür.
Thank you for taking your seats. So now I want very briefly to introduce our next session, Education and Responsibility, and maybe touch on some of the things we did this morning. There are two perspectives with the subject that we're dealing with here. One is the Nazi confiscation of the art, stealing it from other people, and the other is the art itself. And how are the two linked is the question. With the first aspect, I'd like to interject the concept that stealing artworks from Jews was a kind of pre-episode on the path to annihilation. Forgive me. It wasn't the reason for this mass murder. It was a sort of collateral gain, or maybe more than that, but the mass destruction of European Jewry did not aim at gaining wealth. This was a byproduct, if you like. The confiscation of art and cultural assets has to be seen in this context, however, and I think this morning, we already heard that we need to implement this in our study of history and maybe in our study of other subjects. I'm not sure whether art history would be a good place to look at some of these issues, but it ought to be implemented as a regular part of studying history. Both the Nazi confiscation of art and restitution of this art are intrinsically linked. And in our colonial history, it was perhaps considered a matter of course that art was stolen. So this is one perspective of communicating these ideas to the public at large and to our students. And I would like to see permanent exhibitions of historic museums, particularly the Jewish Museum as well, this be incorporated and that this be a permanent part of these exhibitions. Now the difficult part, what does the object itself have to do with the fact that it was stolen? And how emotional is the tie people have to these objects? And of course, there's a whole range of perspectives here. Art is something that many collect because of passion and love for art, but some do it just as an investment. And there are other aspects as well that we need to consider here. And there are two ideas that are on my mind, thinking of the object as something that one loves. I'm thinking of a family from Berlin who fled the Nazis to the United States, and they took a Max Liebermann painting along with them. And they went from their great big flat here in Berlin to a little two-room flat and had this great big Liebermann painting that didn't really fit in their small flat. They could have sold it, but they wanted to have it there, so they cut it so that it would fit in the flat. For every art dealer, a nightmare. But it tells you something about the emotional ties that they had to their painting. Another interesting example on ties people have to paintings was an exhibition in Stuttgart in the 90s. The Art Museum in Stuttgart had an exhibition entitled Above Hempel's Sofa. And this family called Hempel, they bought their sofa. They were a family in Stuttgart and asked them to hang a painting above their sofa. So these were sort of ideas linked to artworks, very separate. On the one, looting of art, and on the other, the love we have to these artworks. They're seen as very separate, maybe. If we transfer this to the colonial history, it's all very different. The provenance research is not so much at the focus of colonial art, but the question of who does art belong to is an issue. If I think of two objects in the Berlin Museum, Nefertiti and the Pergamon altar, they belong to Berlin in some way, and they attract a lot of tourists. And we see similar phenomena in other major museums. So there is a kind of art that goes beyond national interest. I think of Sigmund Freud here and his collection of antiquity, art from antiquity. And he talked about the dirty gods that he had in his kind of art from antiquity. So this just by way of a context for our discussion, and I'd like to mention 3 exhibitions that were special exhibitions, or are special exhibitions in some cases, that do justice to this perspective. One is an exhibition that is currently running in Frankfurt, collected, stolen, and it's got the Fritz Bauer Institute and the Museum of World History, where this whole question of stolen art, I'm thinking of William Kentridge's black box that was shown here. And this is an option in artistic senses to look at some of the colonial crimes, which of course have left their mark, not least in how artworks were taken. So the exhibition Frankfurt is called Stolen, Collected, Obscured. So it's the question of how do we deal with culture as something that creates identity in a community, in a population. How does a community cope if its cultural artifacts have been stolen or have disappeared? Here's a question that I might ask, and it might be answered in some of the presentations. But first, let me pass the floor on to a cooperation with Euronet. They're going to present themselves. It's the question of perspectives of young people from Europe looking at Washington Principles, a cooperation with the EU Story Next Generation Summit. And a little film will be shown and the group will present itself. Hello there, and thank you for allowing us to be here today. Maybe I'll just tell you, first of all, that it's not Euronet, it's U Story. The introduction talked of Euronet. It's a cooperation with U Story Next Generation Summit 2018, working together with the German Lost Art Foundation. So just to tell you a bit about who we are, Lara, Mia, Ladmanaban, and Trixie Style are sitting next to me. They're first semesters. One is studying, is it history and philosophy and archaeology, and the other is archaeology and anthropology. So these two up here represent a very interesting academic background, which they represent here. I'm Stephanie Kapinski, and I work on the Gulit project. Maybe we'll just play the film. I don't know who's going to be doing that.
What an amazing painting.
Yes, it is.
I wonder what the history is behind it.
Oh, you mean the Provenance?
Yeah, let's take a look.
Oh, it doesn't seem to be anything.
So, who does the painting belong to?
The first thing I think of when I hear Washington Principles is probably justice, or like an attempt to ensure justice, and also cultural value, maybe.
The Washington Principles are there to help us get a regulation or some idea of how to do it and what we have to do to fix the stolen artworks.
Is your artwork confiscated? Are you unable to find it? Are you unable to get it back? Is no one listening to you? There must be a better way. Try Washington Principles. These 11 simple principles only for $19.98. Side effects may include
When I interviewed my teacher about the Washington Principles, he thinks that any objects or artwork that were stolen or taken from families should be returned to those families because of their value, not only to the families but also to society. And he believed that art is a foundation for who we are, and if they're not returned to those people, then they're missing a part of their identity, perhaps.
So in our day, we're kind of in the last 5-10 years where we could really communicate with the Shoah survivors, the Holocaust survivors, or even anybody that was that went through anguish and turmoil in the Second World War. And now is the time, I think, especially now is the time to get our records right before this generation disappears.
I believe that we need to reform the principles, maybe, make them more relevant to today, and to ensure that the effort is stronger again.
It is hard to establish to whom the art that was looted and stolen should be returned to, and what is fair and just for both parties concerned. Many families were forced to sell their artworks when facing persecution, and their heirs are often unaware of the art's whereabouts. Restitution of art concerns research, cooperation, and moral obligations.
Was Sie hier gesehen haben, ist das Produkt.
What you have seen here is the product of a workshop with the title Restitution of Art. It was held 2 weeks ago here in Berlin, and as you've just seen, the variety of different participants came from 12 different countries. And what we thought was that the Washington Principles, what are they? How do they help us today? How might we improve them? And what about the restitution of art these days? Above all, we asked what would be a meaningful prospect for the future, and which are the questions that concern us, particularly the younger generation. All of this against the backdrop that those actual survivors, the witnesses who still can lend their view to the public debate, won't be able to do so for much longer. And that is why it's so interesting to see what is the generation thinking about the Washington Principles, who will be the ones in whose hands this subject will lie. Now, we've been asked to do a bit of a Q&A round, so I would like to have a dialogue with the two of you, almost a bit like what we did in the workshop. So let's start. What is it that you're thinking of when you hear the term Washington Principles? What is your first association that comes to your mind? Well, The first thing I'm thinking of is justice, because it was injustice for the Nazis to steal these artworks, and justice also means making good restitution, compensation. And the Washington Principles also give us a moral duty at the international level as well as for every single national country individually. Yeah, that's what I think of when I hear Washington Principles. For me, the Washington Principles also mean that we have to deal with the past, work through the past, and it means to remember what happened, never to forget. And as part of this, it means being open-minded vis-à-vis history and to recognize what happened and not to be silent about it, but devote attention to the issue. Thank you. Perhaps my second question is, when you prepared for this workshop, you were given a job to do, namely, you had to ask an older member of your family about Washington Principles, what they think of it, and basically to get the general mood about the restitution of art and how important it is. What was the feedback you got from, say, your relatives or the relatives of other participants? Well, first of all, when I heard about this workshop and that I was scheduled to be part of it, I had to understand what the Washington Principles are. I didn't know that such a thing existed. I mean, sure, once in a while you ask yourself what happened with these artworks when you went through a museum, but I was completely unaware that there was such a thing as the Washington Principles, and they celebrate their 20th anniversary, which is the reason why the workshop was held in the first place. So, yeah, my interviewee was a man who was very interested. He also recognized the moral duty that we have for restituting the art, for returning these stolen artworks. The question as to how was what we looked at very quickly, because there are so many problems that we encountered immediately once we sort of thought about the issue. And that well, that was my interviewee. Other people in the workshop interviewed their teachers, for example, and there was one teacher who said art was a cultural identity as well, and in this context he also said how necessary it was to return such object, which I thought was a very interesting point to make. In my case, again, before I looked into the workshop issue, I had no idea about the Washington Principles. And my interview partner had not heard about this either. And that was exactly the same feedback that other workshop participants got. The people they were interviewing also didn't know the Washington Principles beforehand. But my grandmother, for example, she also said that it was the first time that she heard of the subject was when the Golit exhibition was talked about in the media. Okay, so as a little sort of add-on, because I was there during your workshop, so I remember it. What I thought was very interesting is that everybody, the people who were part of the workshop and the people you spoke to, all said it was an interesting and relevant subject, and that there was a distinctive need for research, and as far as possible, a return should be made with some slight proviso. One of the participants, a grandmother, was frightened that maybe museums would end up standing empty. But I don't think we got to that yet. Yes, there was a case that people weren't quite clear about whether there should be, you know, a cash repayment or any other form of repayment instead of return. There were many questions that we were raising in this workshop. Could you perhaps go into detail on that? I mean, was it the physical restitution of artworks as compared to monetary compensation pay? What was the result of that debate? One of the interesting issues raised was by an Israeli participant. At one point, he had an opinion which many of us agreed with, that you have to draw a line under physical restitution eventually, simply because there'll come a time when it simply isn't possible to prove anymore whether a certain, say, painting still does belong to certain heirs. And he and most of us thought it might be easier to give the heirs an option to have a say in where, in which country, which museum a certain artwork were to be exhibited, but physical restitution to the heir or heir's family would then no longer be necessary. And then some monetary recompense might be made. That would be plausible, but it would be, negotiable. But I don't think we went into sort of, more explanations about this. In our workshop, participants always wanted to take into account the claims of the wider public. It was clear that somebody who was expropriated has a right to be restituted, while equally we also looked at the claims of museums or the public as such, and to see to what extent paintings should perhaps remain in museums so everybody has access to them. Okay, just to ask again, physical restitution, i.e. the actual return of a cultural object to direct successors, immediate heirs, that was something you thought made sense, but when it gets to the great-great-grandnephew's grandson who'd never heard of the actual sufferer or victim, that you found more difficult to justify, if I remember that correctly? And could you also tell us to what extent, or, well, what sort of ideas did you come up with about restitution? For example, to have exhibitions traveling the world. You had some ideas about this, didn't you? Yes, we had the idea of an exhibition that we should have sort of regular intervals, international exhibitions showing works of art that had been stolen during the Nazi period. And the idea behind it was that it would make people more aware of the issue and provide maybe more attention to the whole thing for the public. And on the other hand, the question was, what about the heirs? Because they wouldn't have this painting or what it was anymore. It might be in this traveling exhibition somewhere at the other side of the world. So that's why we had this idea of a digital exhibition, so that people can always look at the painting online, which means that you're not physically in possession of the pictures, but digitization, which was quite an issue in our workshop, would make it possible for people to be in virtual close proximity. Thank you very much. Let's come to the next question. What we've been doing is, for example, to discuss this famous terminology of the fair and just solution, which is one of the things that we raised earlier. And when lots of different people are involved in this process, and depending on who that person is, there might be very different views as to what exactly constitutes fair and just. What would be positive examples or characteristics you'd like to see? First of all, we thought, what are fair and just solutions in the first place? Because initially it was difficult for us to understand what exactly that was supposed to mean, because it's a pretty vague term. So what we thought is that it refers to a compromise solution, a compromise to be achieved between the parties involved. And in our workshop, we dealt with certain case studies. And there was an example we liked where, in the wake of the Gurlitt exhibition, some drawings were discovered which had been stolen. And the solution for this issue was that the drawings were to remain in the public sphere, but ultimately they'd be in a museum outside of Germany, because the individual who had been expropriated wanted it this way. Yeah, basically we were most happy, all of us, once both parties agreed and ended up with a solution which they both liked, whether it was bare restitution without any sort of buyback or something like that, which had happened in some cases, but certainly a symbolic monetary value had been handed over. That is the original purchase price. And I think we were always happiest if both parties went for such a compromise solution, quite apart and unrelated to public opinion. And if both parties agreed, well, that's the best possible solution, isn't it? Well said. Now, let's come to what is perhaps most important. The purpose of the workshop was for you to draw up something like a roadmap for the future, because what we really want to discuss is how we will deal with the Washington principles in the future, whether they can be improved so that they're more beneficial in the future. So which ideas did you come up with, or which proposals? We worked in small subgroups, and the group I was part of ended up writing an appeal, and I think we brought that with us in case somebody can perhaps read it. But what it means is we would like to see a central international organization set up, maybe organized under the auspices of UNESCO, and this organization would make sure that the Washington Principle would be implemented. In other words, there would no longer be purely voluntary principles, but there would be a political commitment for their implementation. We also consider it to be important to attract public attention to this issue. To that end, we thought of setting up traveling exhibitions, as we mentioned. And another option was that maybe in museums they should always have a provenance notice with each and every item exhibited, so that people are aware of these things. But on the other hand, we also discussed at length private art collections. There was some criticism made, actually, because the public sometimes prevents private art collectors to become public, because there is a chance or danger to get a media run, and so many people don't dare go public. So it's a very sensitive issue, and maybe it would be better to do it sort of without public involvement, or that the art collectors are given the opportunity to obtain both legal assistance and monetary assistance as well, in order to take some of the astringency out, so that people can say, well, I might have Nazi stolen art in my collection, but that's an issue that requires a lot of work still. And when we're looking at sort of online databases where the paintings can be listed, we still think that as well as traveling exhibitions would be a solution for the future. We also thought it might make sense to have something like a guidebook for provenance research or restitution, where you can find answers to ordinary questions like FAQs, and you could also find the list of best practice examples, simply to provide a prop for people who would like to know more about this. Another important matter, as we've learned in the workshop, is that we had no idea what the Washington Principles are, nor did our interviewees. Our friends didn't know. I mean, actually, very few people had a clue that there was such a thing as the Washington Principles. So actually, we need to draw people's attention to it, tell more people about it. And I think the workshop for us was a very good beginning, because we did have people from 12 different countries, and they are now going to tell their family and their friends about this. And that's a good start, I'd say. Thank you. Which point or which part of the Washington Principles would you like to review? Or are there several points you would like to review? How about it? Well, perhaps first of all, the sentences written before the principles, right before it really starts. it's written that every country has its own legal system and that the Washington Principles would have to be implemented within these different legal systems. But the problem is that the legal system in some countries actually contradicts the Washington Principles. So one has to try and really push through the Washington Principles. Worst case, it means redrafting some laws. Yeah, that was definitely the case. We looked at some of the just and fair solutions, which we kept going back to because it's such a widely defined term, which you can take to mean all sorts of things. But on the other hand, we also see that it might enhance something, and maybe it would be better to find another sort of word or term. What we'd also like to see is that in the long term, the Washington Principles should apply not just to Nazi stolen art, but should also be used to describe colonial cultural goods. And, I think there was a case in Spain that we discussed by way of an example. Thank you for that. Before we come to the end, because we don't want to run out of time, how were you affected in the way you relate to cultural items? I mean, 2 weeks is not a long time, but if you now go to a museum or look into this issue, do you think there's going to be a change? Will you look at the objects on exhibition differently? Oh, yes. Particularly, I'm a student of archaeology, so I can say that I would love to see each and every time who used to own certain objects, what the history of the object is. It's not just they're an object of history, but they themselves, the object, have a history. So to have little notice boards that should always be next to a painting or other object, and I'd like to see a list of that. And if I were to make an archaeological find, I would put such a notice next to it. I can only agree with that. And something else that strikes me is the fact that research results should and have to be presented to the public, because that's the only way in which changes of attitude can be affected. Thank you. I think that's a great end, and thanks very much to the organizers as well. And perhaps you like what we said, what we come up with, or the students come up with rather. And we're quite happy to answer questions if you have any, either later during the discussion round or any other time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very good to see that the Washington Principles are in good hands with our youth and should be rolled out throughout Europe. We're going to make a slight change and bring Edmund de Waal's talk forward, because he will have to go to the airport in a minute, and the rest of the program will stay the same. Let me just introduce Edmund de Waal to you briefly. In September '64, he was born in Nottingham, and he comes from a well-known Jewish banker's family whose was disappropriated by the Nazis in 1938. The Hair with the Amber Eyes, A Hidden Inheritance, is a book that he wrote, which is almost a monument that he wrote for this family and received the Costa Book Award. And when he studied at the King's School in Canterbury, he learned pottery, and he opened a pottery in Wales. Since 2004, de Waal has been a professor of ceramics at the University of Westminster in London, and his ceramics are very much influenced by Japanese pottery, and he lived in Japan for a long time, and I'd like to give him the floor now.
So it's late. It's my 55th birthday next year. My father is 90. My children are growing up. My oldest is now 20, my youngest 16. It's 30 years since I buried my grandmother, 25 years since I said Kaddish for my great uncle in a Buddhist cemetery in Tokyo. And it's 20 years since I began to think about telling a family story. It's 20 years, exactly the same age as my oldest boy, Benjamin. 20 years since I discovered that actually I needed to go on the road because I had a father who was getting older and a small child who I owed a responsibility to. And I knew that my father had a very strong accent. But I also knew that my father hadn't told me anything about his childhood. And now he's 90. It's the eve of departure. It's the eve of departure for many of his generation. He is the last person in my family who can tell you what it was like to sit in a Viennese dining room on the Ringstrasse and eat Kaiserschmarrn. He's the last person to tell you what it was like to be woken up early in the morning by the street sweepers outside his window overlooking the Volkskirche and the university. He's the last person who can walk you round in conversation around a family house. And because he's the last person, it becomes even more imperative to think about what this eve of departure actually means. We are on the eve of departure. Our responsibility for this departure, for these people of this generation, for these stories, is an imperative. There are all kinds of imperatives, but this is my imperative. We're lucky, I hear you say. We have some things. We do. But I think it's painful to be told how lucky you are by anyone. What we have is a collection that tells a particular story of Jewish identity, of migration, of hands held in different cities, in different places, in Paris in the 1870s and 1880s, in Vienna from 1898, through the Anschluss, through recovery and restitution, into the hands of my children, through my particular great-uncle Ignaz and his extraordinary sojourn, taking them home to Tokyo. So what do you do with a story? What do you do with a story that is entirely the heart of the reason why we're here today? That is entirely the imperative and responsibility of us collectively. What do you do with the story? And so I have in my studio my father, 90, who spends his afternoons playing chess in the local refugee center with Kosovan, Albanian, Syrian refugees, because he says, I have to play chess as a refugee with all refugees. And I have my three fierce children, who say, what do we do with our family story now? So I have all this collection of beautiful, handled storied objects out in my studio in South London. I have my father, we have coffee, I have my children, and we look at them. And we decide it is time to restitute the Netsuke, restitute our story. I'm using this word in a very provocative and important way. It is time for us to restitute our story. And so we decide to do one thing in two parts. The first thing is to take a collection from this collection and sell it. And last week we sold 70 of these Netsuke for the Refugee Council in London. They raised a huge amount of money, and those 70 Netsuke will support unaccompanied refugee children, because my father was a refugee child. And the rest I take back to Vienna. And we put them on long-term loan, a 10-year loan. And my God, that hurts, I can tell you. A 10-year loan to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. So I pack them up in these cases, and I take them in 2 suitcases, similar to the suitcases that they came back from Vienna in 1946. And I take them 2 weeks ago to the Jewish Museum, and I give them to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, who can then tell the story of a family in Vienna. Now, why does this matter? It matters because collections continue to have different kinds of stories. The power of stories is that they generate more stories. They are not singular. A family story is not something you can own. It generates and brings out other stories. It brings out other stories. That's the point that I discovered unintentionally when I wrote a book about my family. 3,000 copies were printed in Britain because there is no market for Jewish memoir. 2 million copies later, 39 editions later, I still have 500 letters a year from people telling me their stories. Stories beget stories. So the Netsuke belong in my family, but they belong even more importantly in a museum that can start to tell the story of Jewish culture in Vienna, a family of migration, a family in exile, and how things survive sometimes. And so the museum becomes the custodian of our family collection. They are held elsewhere. And I write, and this I think probably is the only time, there are many lawyers amongst you, the first time in museum legal history it's been written into the protocol that the Netsuke are to be taken out and handled. Not that they are to be kept safe, but that they are to be taken out and handed round with children. And that's provocative, because it says that stories provoke stories. It's a kind of restitution. It's saying that Vienna is a place of loss. It's lost communities and societies and all kinds of possibilities by losing its Jewish families. But you can provoke those questions now with more imperative and more clarity than you ever need to do. So this is about taking things back. So what happens when I get an invitation from Vienna, a place I find difficult, a place to make an installation for the Theseus Temple, this great neoclassical temple on the Ringstrasse? It's a place that for 10 years has been used for contemporary art installations. What do I do with this invitation? I decide that I will make an installation of 264 white pots. I make an installation in 2 vitrines. It's a kind of book. And it's a book based around a poem of the greatest poet of the 20th century, Celan. Celan, of course, is the poet who hated and loved his language, German. It's the language that destroyed his parents. And his poetry is an attempt to remake, reform, break apart, bring into silence the German language. And I take a poem called Lichtzwang, Light Duress, and I make an installation which sits in this extraordinary, beautiful white temple, which is a poem about the color white. Because when you read Celan, you discover that Celan is the poet of white. White, he says, is the color of homecoming. It's the color I will never know. White, he says, is the color of my mother's hair, the hair I will never see. White, he said, is the space around my poems into which I have to go. So I make Lichtzwang and I write this poem in German and in English on the wall of this temple in Vienna. And for 6 months, it's visited by those who are trying to get out of the rain and the local people who want to go and have a drink, and a nice young dance troupe make a piece for it, and the Viennese critics hate it, as Viennese critics are prone to do. But I restitute a poem into Vienna, and then I go back to my studio, and I realize that there is another aspect to Celan, that of course he is also the poet of black, Todesfuge, black milk. So I go back to my studio and I make my first black porcelain, because Celan says that in his great elegy for the Shoah, of black milk, things that were white have been turned into darkness. So I make a huge installation called Black Milk. It's a different kind of conversation with Vienna. And then, complicatedly, I get rung by the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. This doesn't happen to me very often. The Kunsthistorische Museum, as you all know, is the museum that was the energetic force through the looting of Jewish art in the city. The day after the Anschluss, one of the curators from the Kunsthistorische walks the 480 yards between the entrance hall and the entrance hall of my father's house and starts to choose which pictures they will take. So, they say, the Kunsthistorische Museum, please choose your favorite objects in the museum. Curate an exhibition for us about what you love in the Kunsthistorische Museum. Imagine that as a request. And I think about it, and I think about it for another year, and then I say yes. And I decide that what I am going to do in this restitution to Vienna, to the Kunsthistorische Museum, is to make an exhibition of every single object in the museum that worries me. I am going to make an exhibition about anxiety. And I choose Dürer's great watercolor of the apocalypse. He wakes up in the middle of the night, having seen the end of the world, the waters coming down towards him, the earth disappearing. And he writes in this first extraordinary encounter with nightmare, he says, I was alone. I was completely alone. There was nothing I could do. And when I see this image, which is owned by the Kunsthistorische Museum, I know that this is the experience of being alone at night. This is the experience that I want to bring back to the Kunsthistorische Museum. that sense of being alone at night in Vienna. This doesn't go down too well with the curators. That's English understatement, for the record. So a one-year project becomes a 4-year project, and I choose all the objects in the museum which have shadows, the objects which are about poison. These are bezoars which you kept near you in fear of poison. I find things in the Kunstkammer which are about fear, the devil. And I bring Dürer's great image of Kristallnacht, of the Anschluss, of that feeling of total aloneness, and put it in the heart of the exhibition. And I make, thinking of Celan, a new installation which I call During the Night. And it's black porcelain, and it's lead. And my studio used to be an ammunition factory. And I bring the small tin boxes that housed bullets and gunpowder, and I make a beautiful installation about anxiety. And that is another kind of restitution. It's saying you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for the government, for the national museums, for the Provenance researchers who are extraordinary, for the lawyers who sometimes are extraordinary, for all the people to line up their extraordinary documents and make something happen. You can take the issue, you can take the power of the story back to the place where it belongs, and you can re-change the energy of that city. You can redo it. You can bring back loss and make it into something else. And when you do that, you beget stories. Stories beget stories. And so this exhibition in Vienna means that I can look the Kunsthistorische Museum in the face. I can look at its shadows, its institutional shadows. I can look at its sense of where it belongs and sits within the city, and I can look it in the eye and say, I restituted you, not you restituted me. And then, what do you continue to do? Things change. A person today brought a book, a catalogue of a sale in 1880 in Vienna, opens it at page 6, and there's a sale, Dürer, and the name Efrussi. Where's that Dürer drawing gone? 3 weeks ago in Vienna, in the National Library, they start to find the lost library of my great-grandfather. There on the shelves are some of my great-grandfather's lost books. It continues to be a provocation. It continues to be live. So what do you do? What do you do? What is your responsibility? So I decide that what I am going to do is to create, for the people of the book, a new library. It's going to begin next year in the ghetto, in Venice, the original ghetto. It's going to be starting in the Canton Scuola, that beautiful synagogue, where in the women's gallery of this astonishingly beautiful 16th century synagogue, I'm making an installation called Psalm, Why psalm? Psalm because the Psalms are, of course, the great songs of exile. They are the great poems of loss of place. They are also the great songs of the individual voice crying out, and the collective response, the collective voice. It's the singular and the collective. And so in this synagogue and in the sukkah, next year, this is just this beautiful sukkah looking out over the ghetto. I'm making an installation called Psalm. You have to come. There will be music, there will be psalms, and there will be prayers. And then, because Venice is the center of the world, because Venice is the place where the ghetto speaks 19 languages, because Venice is the place where there is the first extraordinary printing of the Talmud by Daniel Bomberg in 1540, this extraordinary printing which goes across the world, I decide that I am going to make a new library. I'm haunted by lost libraries. I'm haunted by them. They keep me awake. I think of all those lost libraries, not only those great resonant places from Constantinople onwards, but I think of all those great rabbinical libraries from the 18th and 19th century destroyed during the Holocaust. I think tenderly of my great-grandfather Victor, the unintentional banker who wanted to be a scholar and spent his life collecting early books and saw his whole collection of books put on a truck in the courtyard of his family house, the Palais Uffizi, and taken off down the Ringstrasse, never to be seen again. And I think of the lost libraries of Mosul, the lost libraries of last week. So I decide that I'm going to make a new library. It's going to be in the Ateneo, the great meeting place in Venice for 500 years. And what it is going to be within this beautiful building is a collection of thousands of books of exile. Thousands of books written by people who have been refugees or have been forced into exile from the 2nd century to now. Every single language is going to be there. It's housed in a beautiful space. These are the walls made of porcelain, and on these walls I'm writing a text about lost libraries. It's a space you go into, a space in which you can find a book in your own language, a book written in exile. It's going to be a space where there will be storytelling and conversations about translation between writers from all communities, old and new, Jewish, Gentile, and every other community under the sun. It starts here in Venice, my new library called Psalm. It's a beautiful space, and I pray that it will come here to Germany. I hope it will come here on its travels, its migratory travels, possibly, God willing, to Dresden, possibly, God willing, to Berlin, and then onwards throughout Europe and into America. What I'm trying to do is something very, very simple. It's taking a lost library, a lost conversation, and bringing it again in a renewed way, creating a new space where ideas of exile can be restituted to a different kind of community now. It's what we have to do. We are on the eve of departure, and it is very late in the day. Thank you.
Do you know, that's really a beautiful response. And, you know, it's a very special community to be part of. I'm very deeply grateful. Thank you.
Edmund de Waal, 1,000 thank yous. We could close the conference, really, couldn't we, after that? But we won't. We have many further speeches that we want to listen to, even though we've sort of rejigged our program for time reasons. We're going to continue now to think about what shift of perspectives is necessary to allow objects to tell new stories. We'll be listening to a few examples, and I'd like to ask you to welcome Laurent Segal, the Director General of the Fondation de Judaïsme du Français, a non-profit organization which comes up with a number of educational programs. Bienvenue, Laurence.
After Edmund de Waal's speech, I'm afraid it's really not worth listening to me. He was a gift, but it's not a gift to speak after an artist. And I'm speaking of the past, and he's speaking of the future. Anyway, it's really an honor to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers who have invited me. I also want to extend my warmest greetings to my friends Isabelle Lemann de Chermont and Shlomit Steinberg, who curated the exhibition looking for owners with the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme. In the 1990s, the French Ministry of Culture was severely criticized as regard to the little efforts which had been made through the 4 preceding decades in order to research the rightful owners of the remnant of the MNR, the looted works of art which had been returned to France and were still in the custody of French Museum half a century later. But a sense that time had come for the witnesses were diminishing and that family had maybe one last opportunity to claim for justice. A general report on museums issued in 1997 by the Cour des Comptes, which is a national auditing high court, expressed surprise that provenance research and art restitution were not on the museum administration agenda any longer, thus challenging the French cultural policy. However, prior to the Washington Conference in 1998, the French authorities organized several highly visible events, a conference on pillages and restitutions in 1996, the display of a great number of MNR works in major national museums and in the provinces in 97, and displaying the MNR from the Musée National d'Art Moderne, the Centre Pompidou, at the opening exhibition of the new Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme in December 1998, exactly at the time of the Washington Conference. But the most significant achievement still remains the creation of the Mertoli Mission in 1997, under the auspices of the Prime Minister. Before and during the Washington Conference, the French representative came under heavy criticism in regards with the MNR. In 2000, among several reports published by academics and historians of the Mertoli Mission, a specific report entitled The Pillage of Artworks During the Occupation and the Current State of the 2,000 Works Assigned to the National Museums was published by the Directorate of French Museum at the Pompidou Center. Several recommendations were issued in this report. They all aimed to helping restitution and serving education. The recommendation number 15 read as follows. The mission recommends that in order to bear witness to the plundering of Jewish properties, a few significant works should be selected on the basis of a mutual agreement among the MNR and be sent on long-term loan to the Israel Museum. They should be exhibited with full information concerning their origins and the reason why they are put on display at the Israel Museum. Discussion between France and Israel went on until it was decided that a major temporary exhibition illustrating the history of art looting by the Nazis in France and further would be far more efficient than a limited permanent loan. This agreement was soon to be confirmed at the highest level of both French and Israeli governments. But several years elapsed before the plan came to fruition. Discussions were resumed in 2004 between the Israel Museum, James Snyder, and the Directorate of the French Museum, then headed by Francine Mariani-Ducret. The two main issues were, first, selecting the works, and second, securing legal protection against a possible seizure in case some paintings would be claimed by any organization or individual while on loan abroad. Isabelle Lemann de Chermont and Shlomit Steinberg were already in charge of the exhibition and artwork. As the chief curator of the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, I was later invited to be part of an executive committee. And while discussing the general idea behind the exhibition, like how will telling the story of the plundering of Jewish art, describing the French attitude in the wake of liberation, reinitiating research and restitution processes, it appeared that such an account had not been provided yet in France. The quickly wrapped displays of MNR in 1997 had not yielded place to an in-depth explanation of the different stages of the problem. So it was obvious and easy to advocate that the explanatory action, which was in the making for the Israel Museum, should benefit the French audience as well. Soon a decision was made by the Ministry of Culture to show the exhibition in Paris at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme after the Israel Museum. The discussions concerning the exhibition concept showed the discrepancy between two visions among the French stakeholders themselves and between France and Israel. The Israel Museum curator of the exhibition, Shlomit Steinberg, had sent a wish list of masterpieces. The French group of curators was in charge of examining both from a conservation point of view and from a more general vantage, including visibility, claims in progress, critical works, how far the loan request of Jerusalem was relevant and feasible. Several compromises resulted in an exhibition consisting of 53 paintings by Peter Klaas, Petrus Christus, Peter de Hoor, Simon Vouet, Courbet, Delacroix, Ingres, Monet, Manet, Cézanne, Degas, Matisse, Max Ernst, a vast majority being registered as MNR, but not all of them. The exhibition was entitled Looking for Owner, French Policy for Provenance, Research, Restitution and Custody of Art Stolen in France during World War II. And it was translated in French as À qui appartenaient ces tableaux? A complaint was processed at that time by the Ashava, an NGO established in 2007 in order to bring historical justice to the victims of the Holocaust in Israel and to reinstate with their legal heirs those assets which were located in Israel before their owners found their deaths under the Nazi regime. The Israel Museum thus made the decision to hold two parallel exhibitions, Orphaned Art as a companion story to Looking for Owners. While the Israel Museum intention was to stress the quality of the painting on display, the French paintings, which incidentally overshadowed the display of works recovered by the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Organization, which was sent to Israel in 1948, Isabelle Leman de Chermont and I, we took advantage of the same exhibition to go over the process of art spoliation. We arranged the exhibition into several parts according to the various stakeholders and most common scenarios of the spoliation. And the same concept was applied to the catalog. Art was shown as an intrinsic part of the destruction of the European Jewry by the Nazi as a consequence and a motivation of racial discrimination. Our work was meant to provide the larger audience with a description of the grim process of art plundering and the role of the many participants. Actually, making an exhibition on the MNR made per se impossible to tell moving personal stories. So we had rather decided to tell the history of art plundering and restituting. The catalog of works was conceived accordingly and offered a kind of typological approach on the looting procedures. So we just listed the Nazi organization with the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, the famous ERA, the Devisenschutzkommando, which acted under the authority of Goering services and was responsible for seizing valuable assets with the help of the Vichy General Commission for Jewish Question. So we had exemplified each way of looting. In this case, it was a Hubert Robert stolen from Alfred Landon. Then we had the Dienststelle Westen, the Nazi organization which was responsible for the Möbel action, namely the plundering of apartments' content and the shipping of this booty to the Reich territories in agreement with the RR. Actually, this provenance category was richly illustrated and the works carefully chosen to explain how difficult it is to start investigation when you have no consistent artist name. We had paintings known as Wilhelm Kalf when returned from Germany and which was now assigned to Roerstraten, when you have no iconographic specifics which can help identification, or a wrong track like misunderstood inscriptions. Then you have the category of exchanges made by the most prominent Nazi leaders, Hitler, Goering, or Ribbentrop, ancient painting being exchanged with degenerate art, looted from dealers and galleries which were specialized in artists like Picasso, Matisse, and Léger. And of course, we mentioned the Paul Rosenberg gallery. Then you had a lot of purchases on the French art market. Obviously, this category gathered the greatest number of paintings. Was it meant to advocate the reason why provenance research had proven to be so slow and difficult? Probably, and rightly so. The usual suspects were all brought together: Theo Ermsen, Hildebrand Gurlitt, Bruno Lohse, Rochlitz, Hoffer, Maria Dietrich. The most common destinations were well represented: museum with Linz, Wallraf Richards, Krefeld, and the Goering collection. And we had some magnificent masterpieces like the Ingres, Simon Vouet, which, by the way, the Ingres was not looted art. Then restitutions. We decided to show restitutions. And they were exemplified by the Peter de Hoog, which was chosen by the Israel Museum as the poster for the exhibition. The Peter de Hoog was stolen from Edward de Rothschild, then transferred by the German embassy to Göring, and then restituted and eventually presented by Edward's daughter to the Louvre in 1974. A special chapter was dedicated to the looting of Adolf Schloss collection, a famous collection of northern paintings, which was at the heart of a fierce competition between the German occupier and the Commissariat Général de la Question Juive. The case sheds light on the intricate relations between the Nazi regime, the Vichy administration, and art dealers, and it was described at length in the catalogue. A specific section dealt with the highly symbolic restitution of 28 paintings and drawings by Helmut Kohl to François Mitterrand on the occasion of the French-German summit in 1994. Bénédicte Savoy mentioned that. The catalogue was based on the Materli Mission report on looted art, and updated catalogue entries were based on the 2004 Emmener catalogue. Together with Isabelle Lemain de Chermont, who authored the 2000 report, we discussed some inflections to be taken. One of the most significant steps was to raise doubts on the statement of the French Museum, saying that less than 10% of the MNR are proven to be looted. It opened up to a kind of change of mentality towards reasonable doubts. The long introduction, though probably too gentle toward the inertia of the French Museum until the 1990s, was very clear about the consequence of the French legislation against Jews and refugees on easing the Nazi plundering, on the role of French dealers, and on the intertwining of a bustling art market and the theft. In their foreword, Bernard Kouchner, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Christine Albanel, Minister of Culture, both very sincerely committed to examining the Vichy period. She was the special advisor to Jacques Chirac and helped a lot in his declaration. And Bernard Kouchner, being of Jewish origin, was also very motivated. However, they stated that they could be proud of this policy handling the MNR and of the intensified efforts made since 1997, efforts which could be regarded as the expression of our ongoing fight against anti-Semitism. I must say that it's interesting to know that all the efforts made to take upon us meaning the museum professionals, to take upon us some responsibility in the delayed efforts in provenance research, disappeared in the press release which presented France as a victim of the occupier in the case of looted art and a diligent player in returning artworks to their legitimate owners. The paintings were displayed with detailed labels, and some had photos of their back when available. A portal presenting all the existing tools and databases then available had been elaborated in common with the Israel Museum and was accessible on the premises of both exhibitions. Finally, an important conference, and many of you were there, was organized as a key component of the exhibition. It included almost all the categories of stakeholders, including claimants, law firms, auction houses, representatives of European and American compensation and restitution organization, historian, curators, and the CIVS. This conference couldn't be suspected of being apologetic or of understating the responsibility of French Museum. Additional and challenging comments were provided by participants, and the conference was concluded with the feeling that maybe something was changing in the field of France. So what was the impact of the exhibition? One painting, the Matisse, which had been found in Kurt Gerstein's belongings, was returned to the rightful successors of the collector immediately after the exhibition, but without any relation to it, since the claim had been processed beforehand. Though the Prague conference held in 2009 reassessed the need for further provenance research for applying due diligence and building expeditiously and fair solutions, it didn't help much. The six works which were restituted in 2012 were not part of the MNR. It took a few more years until in 2013, Mrs. Filippetti, then Minister of Culture, initiated a new policy. In an official letter, she addressed the need for being proactive, since waiting for claimants to bring their own case had proven ineffective and unfair. This was a radical change. The duty was not any longer on the claimants, but on the keepers. A task force of curators was created to boost provenance research, chaired by a member of the CIVS. In doing so, the minister acknowledged the role of a competent jurisdiction which had proved its expertise in provenance research and inheritor research in fair indemnification, and the need to have experts independent from the museums. A recent change in this organization has just been made, and we do hope it will bring us to a new era. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Florence. Wir werden
And we will hear more stories about attempts to offer educative responses and some of the responses of provenance research and how it's been fed into people's everyday lives. And we're going to hear now from Rainer Stamm from the Oldenburg Art Museum, and he's been the director as an art historian since 2010 of the Land Museum for Art and Cultural History in Oldenburg. You have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, after the very impressive words that we have heard so far, I feel very modest, particularly from this vision of Edmund de Waals. I have been invited to speak briefly about what we have done in Oldenburg to try to communicate provenance research to the public. It's not particularly a benchmark, it's just one example of practitioners, and I see it as representative of many exhibitions who have done and held exhibitions on provenance research. And I would want to follow on from what Christoph Zuschlag said. I do see a kind of provenance turn happening. I like that idea. So the core mandates of collecting, researching, preserving, and communicating are part of a museum's job description, and we pursue these aims passionately. Just as the Washington Principles have expanded the aspect of researching by a crucial component, communicating provenance research to the public is now a new challenge of our everyday work. So I want to tell you a bit about how we've tried to do this in the Landesmuseum in Oldenburg, which we have developed since the beginning of our systematic research of the provenance and history of the works in our collection. So first of all, to tell you a bit about how the history of provenance research has taken place in the Oldenburg Museum, building, first of all, on a sort of rough scaling system by category of the acquisition history, which I came up with a colleague of mine from an art collection from the Böttcher Strasse. Our provenance researcher, Markus Kensler, came up with a sort of expanded four-color scale to classify contexts of acquisition that were very heterogeneous. And we recommended this. We recommended this to the German Lost Art Foundation as well. Of course, it became a lot more difficult as we proceeded. How could the complex context of the sales of works by people persecuted by the Nazis, appropriation, theft, and storage be communicated in museums live? And often we have press reports. In the case of restitutions, we hear about amicable settlements as well. And since 2012, we've also been teaching at the Kaufmann Ossietzky University, and we've heard how important it is as well that we communicate these skills to the younger generation, our students. A clear change of public interest, not only for these spectacular individual cases, but also the systematic history of the theft of art by the Nazis and the art trade during the Third Reich came to light through what's come to be called the Schwabinger Trove, or the Gurlitt case. If before, very expensive individual pieces were at the focus of reporting, and we often heard responses from the public that were assuming it was only about individual cases that could easily be tracked. But in the public and the visitors to our museum, we saw an increase in the public acceptance of the need to critically examine the confiscation of art by the Nazis. And of course, collecting and researching and preserving are part of what we do. But education and communicating these ideas is also part of what we do. And I think we're all very active in trying to do this. Here briefly, just to give you the color scale for the classification of provenance. This is something many institutions use, this sort of traffic light system. And here, just to show you some of the headlines, maybe one of the things that triggered this, it wasn't just the Washington conference, but it was also whatever we may think about the Gurlitt case and the way it was received. Certainly this put provenance in the limelight. So whatever our position may be on the Gurlitt case, certainly the extraordinarily broad-based international reporting on this case went hand in hand with an opportunity and an obligation to communicate provenance research that takes place in our museums. And this becomes clear with the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about a year after the Schwabing art trove was found that we saw the first exhibitions in German museums about provenance. There's the Museum of Art and Crafts, the Kunst- und Gewerbemuseum in Hamburg, the Bremen Kunsthalle, and the museum in Schwerin. These were exhibitions that presented examples of provenance from their own collections. This was 2014, and Cologne and Karlsruhe followed suit in the years afterwards. The State Museum for Art and Cultural History in Oldenburg had its first exhibition in 2017. We were pursuing the following question: how, in an exhibition, can we cover both the generally well-known concepts and questions, as well as the regional and collection-specific specificities of the appropriation, confiscation of art by the Nazis? How can we make this visible? How can we generate awareness and understanding about the different levels of art trade and art policy in the Nazi period? And how can we show pictures of this? How can we address issues such as the Führermuseum Linz, the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, or the Entartete Kunst campaign, Degenerate Art campaign? How can we target these, but also look at the regional specific aspects, the collectors, dealers, and functionaries in our region? And then the issue that was so important, as it was shocking for the Weser Ems room, of the systematic distribution of what was euphemistically called the Holland Möbel, furniture from the Netherlands, and the dialectic positioning of the museum itself during the Third Reich. So in the sense of doing both the one and the other, we went for a sort of lexicon approach. So the exhibition Herkunft verpflichtet, origin oblige, if you like, covered the history behind these artworks and went from A to Z. So we had 25 alphabet letters looking at areas that we felt were important stations for visitors, as well as for the work of provenance research in our museum. Things of national importance like the central collection part, degenerated arts, the Untitled Kunst or the Führer Museum or Gurlitt were also part of this, as well as things like the Holland Möbel, the name of Rosalie Israel, from which a piece of historic furniture came into our collection, or the Stedingsära collection, which was a Nazi art collection from the Gauweser Ems, and some of the works from this are still in our collection. We looked at the future of provenance research, but also gave a sort of outlook about coming and planned expansions of our research approach to include colonial legacy art lost as a result of political persecution in the Soviet occupation zone and East Germany, the GDR, and wartime evacuated cultural assets, exhibits and artifacts from our collection, and works that have been restituted or are earmarked for restitution made these more abstract concepts take form. While breaking down the exhibition into 25 alphabetical entries had to be enough, the publication that we made to go with the exhibition had 101 entries, a sort of lexicon of provenance research, and also covered aspects that were both relevant on a national or international level, as well as breaking down what that meant in the local region. This structure that we use to communicate provenance research in our museum and in the book that we developed for the exhibition is, of course, not the non plus ultra and has its weaknesses, no doubt, in detail, but I still think that the structure we've chosen is attractive because it can be expanded for various different locations, occasions, and contexts. One can expand it to fit where it's needed. It might be worth thinking about whether or not the Oldenburg lexicon should be put online with the provenance research wikis that have already been mentioned, or the lost art database, or in the Martin Gropiusbau Gurlitt case, to put all of this online as a kind of provenance research wiki, which could be made a kind of lexicon of provenance research and used cooperatively and decentrally, and we could continue to develop it. We have already heard how we want to have the wool-bearing, egg-laying dairy sow, i.e. the hen that lays the golden egg. But it would be perhaps useful to bring together all of the different concepts that are relevant for our work in a simple way. And I have seen this, how the German Lost Art Foundation has a glossary with 5 entries, which I'm sure we could expand. And before we all have lots of different glossaries, why don't we try to work out whether we could just have one central repository for these glossaries. For us, the exhibition and the publication, Herkunft verpflichtet, or Origin oblige, has become an obligation in itself, an obligation to go above and beyond the inner circle of specific provenance research to address the issue of the origin of all of our artifacts in the work that we do and how we communicate and educate the public. We have been holding lectures and have looked at how this can be made part of the permanent exhibition, and we are lucky that we were able to get a full-time position for our provenance researcher by incorporating issues such as what has become known as the Holland Möbel, the furniture stolen from Jews in the Netherlands. We have managed to expand on the Oldenburg restitution collection and have found citizens coming forward with artifacts that they believe were stolen from Jews. And we see ourselves as sort of fiduciary. Of course, our legal position isn't clear, but we have agreed that we will act as a fiduciary and take on these objects that are given to us, and will research their provenance just as much as our own things. Because even if you have only heard people say that in families that these may be stolen from Jews, or if there is significant silence about it. I would like to agree with Edmond de Waal and say that museums have to be stewards of this history and these stories. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Rainer Stamm.
Thank you, Rainer Stamm. Before we now go into the US and look towards the Metropolitan Museum in particular, I'd like to ask, are there any questions right now, something really important you'd like to air? So there's no need to take the floor right now. That's good, thank you. Then I would like to announce a presentation which, as I say, will lead us into having a glimpse of the Met collection. Crystal Force is curator of modern contemporary art at the Museum of Art in New York. Over the past 20 years, that museum has worked hard on the issues of transparency, accessibility, particularly through its online office, and we'll find out more about it now. Welcome, Crystal Force.
Hello, and thank you very much to the DZK for organizing this anniversary conference and for the invitation. 20 years ago, Philippe de Montebello, then director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, chaired a task force of the Association of Art Museum Directors that wrote a landmark report on the spoliation of art during the Nazi era in June of '98. This report was followed 6 months later by the Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, signed by 44 governments. A couple of years later, the American Alliance of Museums formulated the recommended procedures for providing information to the public about objects transferred in Europe during the Nazi era. Since then, American museums have made a wealth of information publicly available by posting online the provenance of the artworks in their care, with a special focus on the period 33 to 45. Of course, American museums were well aware of Nazi art theft before '98. The US was instrumental in post-war restitution efforts, and awareness started before that during the war. In '43, President Franklin Roosevelt established the Roberts Commission to salvage cultural treasures threatened by the Axis powers in Europe. It recruited 345 men and women who served in the newly created Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section, commonly known as the Monuments Men. In 1944, the Office of Strategic Services also created the Art Looting Investigation Unit, or ALIU, tasked to investigate spoliations in Nazi-occupied territories. The majority of Monuments Men and Women and ALIU agents had been museum curators before the war and returned to work in art museums again after the war. For the Met, I will cite James Rorimer, who, after serving as a Monuments Man, became director of the Cloisters and later director of the Met from '55 to '66. Theodore Rousseau, an ALIU agent who was with the Met from '46, first as curator, then chairman of the Department of Paintings, and later vice director of the museum under the directorship of Thomas Hoving. And Edith Standen, who, after serving as director of the Wiesbaden Central Collecting Point, became curator of textiles at the Met, then curator emeritus from 1988. Their profiles can be found on the website of the Monuments Men Foundation. Curators at the Met were thus well aware of the issues pertaining to Nazi-looted art and well connected regarding access to the relevant records. And it is important to underline that before the 90s, Met curators did publish provenance in collection and exhibition catalogs and journals. One example is the provenance of Chardin's Boy Blowing Bubbles, which was published by Ted Rousseau in the Met Bulletin in April of 1950. In 1944, it was seized from a storage company in Paris, where a Jewish collector had placed it and earmarked for Hitler's Linz Museum. It was restituted to the rightful owners after the war, before its acquisition by the Met. This is published in 1950. And here is its provenance as it appears on the Met website today. Another example is a spread from Charles Sterling and Margareta Salinger's 2 volumes titled French Paintings, a Catalogue of the Collection of the Met, published in 66-67. Framed in red is an example of the provenance published for each artwork, and here is its provenance as it appears online today. Yet the amount of time and expertise that museums in general, and the Met in particular, commit to provenance research and the transparency and accessibility of this information have grown significantly since '98. The AMD report and the Washington Principles coincided with the technological revolution that made possible to move from siloed paper files available to cognoscenti on site to linked open data available to all online. But despite undeniable progress, it is not always possible to reconstruct the whole history of every object. Any provenance expert will tell you that we can't dot every I and cross every T, especially when faced with a collection numbering tens or hundreds of thousands of objects. But we do our due diligence, and we post online the provenance we have with the understanding that it's always a work in progress. My understanding is that in Germany, thanks to federal funding, the DZK supports research projects all over the country, but only artworks flagged as likely problematic are posted online on LostArt.de or the Daphne site for Dresden, for instance. This renders a huge part of this excellent research, unfortunately, invisible. And indeed, it must be stated here that the level of expertise in provenance research is very high in Germany, and also that more provenance-centered exhibitions are organized here than anywhere else, 2 in Berlin right now as we speak. I want to stress that in the US, following the recommended procedures of the American Alliance of Museums, most institutions endeavor to post online every artwork that was transferred in continental Europe between 33 to 45 with its provenance, whether it seems ominous or benign. The recommended procedures give enough leeway to enable every museum, and I have to insist that they're private museums for the most part in the US, not federal, state, or municipal collections as in Germany, to enable every museum to approach the task differently, from the way research is coordinated, prioritized, funded, and recorded, to who conducts it, and the meaning of parentheses, for instance, in provenance. Typically, a researcher painstakingly enters provenance into a collection database in mind-bogglingly convoluted X-collection constituent modules. These modules are what enables the data to be searchable. The Met website pulls its collection online from selected data modules in the museum system, or TMS, which then becomes available and searchable on the web. Of course, it gets updated on a regular basis in TMS, then automatically online. You can thus find an artwork through a simple Google search. Now, I have to emphasize that the Met not only posts artworks transferred in Europe between 33 and 45 online, but a much wider range of objects. For years now, we have strived to research and post online as many artworks as possible. So you have, on the one hand, the Met's collection online, which currently comprises roughly 457,000 objects and counting, of which 354,000 have provenance in various states of completion, that is 85%. The collection online comprises more than provenance. For each artwork, it includes a high-quality photograph, what we call the tombstone, title date, medium dimensions, its location, an essay, and various drawers, such as signature and markings, provenance, exhibition history, references, etc. And this is what you see when you open the Provenance drawer. And on the other hand, of those hundreds of thousands of objects online, most with provenance, the Met's Provenance Research Project singles out those works that may have changed ownership in continental Europe between 33 and 45. So how do you find the Provenance Research Project on the Met's website? It's a question I get. Well, first, through a plain Google search, as I showed for the Modigliani, or with the search box on the Met's homepage, which takes you to the right place. Or at the bottom, which is not obvious, at the bottom of the Met's homepage, you go to About the Met, Policies and Documents, and you find the Provenance Research Project. And last but not least, through our new web feature marking the 20th anniversary of the Washington Principles, which you will appreciate in the context of this conference. And by the way, it will live beyond 2018 as a Provenance Research Hub. First, I thought it was important to distinguish the two sources I just mentioned. That is, that there are two places to find provenance on the Met website, the Provenance Research Project and the collection online at large. Then in the web feature, we have the following sections: a historic moment, the 1998 conference and documents, which I mentioned a moment ago, and Provenance Today, which includes our Provenance Research Project, a related series of blog posts, and information on the German-American Provenance Research Exchange Program for museum professionals that Jane Milosh talked about this morning, and of which the Met is one of the partnering institutions. And to emulate Leo Weidinger and at the suggestion of Jane, I would like to ask for the PrEP participants who are still in the room if they would like to, if they'd be willing to stand up. And steering committee and guest speakers, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. A lot of them are not here anymore. It also includes a list of links to various museums, Provenance Research Projects, etc. If you go to the Provenance Research Project, as you scroll down, you can find useful information, including a list of works restituted by the museum, and a list of 53 objects once looted by the Nazis, but restituted to their rightful owners before their acquisition by the Met. And you can see the Chardin that I mentioned earlier in this partial view of the list. When you click on Provenance Research Database, you can browse or search through hundreds of artworks with the option of filters, object type, type, sorry, geographical location, period, and curatorial department. Following the American Alliance of Museums procedures, at first we prioritized European paintings, but now all curatorial departments are proactively researching their objects. Yet evidently, works on paper and multiples, that is, objects that are not unique, such as bronze casts, prints, decorative arts, present their own sets of challenges and dead ends. So here are some random searches within the Provenance Research Project filter. If you search red cap, you get 5 results. If you search Picasso, you get 54. For Wildenstein, you get 51. On the other hand, in the Met collection online at large, you will also find for Mary Cassatt over 3,000 results. And if you enter hippo, you get 46 results, including William, or mascot, and his provenance. Thus, the Met's Provenance Research Project, with its focus on the Holocaust, is not our only repository of ownership history. Indeed, Provenance research has traditionally been an integral part of curatorial research on attribution, authenticity, the history of collecting, and it is, of course, also conducted with regard to cultural property issues. I will now show you a sampling of other American museum websites where provenance can be found, with a focus on transfers in the period 33 to 45. The Getty Museum in Los Angeles, which posts works with gaps in the period 33 to 45. And also the Getty Villa, which has a great team working on antiquities. Note also the contact information for provenance queries, as in the following cases. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which lists works identified as priorities for further research, as well as ownership resolutions and useful links. The Museum of Modern Art in New York, which, in addition to its 1,370 works with provenance online, lists web resources and a bibliography. The Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts, which identifies 429 artworks. And the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which was a leader in this field. By the early 2000s, its website already comprised a remarkable search engine. On the right, you see the start of a list of 322 artworks associated with the collector and donor Chesterdale alone. Like the Met, the National Gallery of Art website offers both its comprehensive online collection as well as a Holocaust-era page, featuring a slideshow of 32 objects that were looted during the war, but archival research showed that each one of those artworks had been returned to its rightful owner after the war, before its acquisition by the National Gallery of Art. On the right is an example, Henri Fontaine-Latour's self-portrait, confiscated by the ERR from the David Weil collection in France, recovered at Alt Aussee, brought to the Munich Central Collecting Point, restituted to France in 1946, and returned to the David Weil family in September of 46. Finally, I'd like to mention that from September 2003, American museums have also been listing their artworks on the Nazi-era Provenance Internet Portal, or NEPIP for short, the American Alliance of Museums Central Registry. Since then, almost 30,000 objects have been posted by 179 art museums. This portal has become arguably less vital with the advent of Google search, and in some cases it can be less up-to-date than the individual museum websites. On the other hand, some museums only post this information through NEPIP. I will end on a sobering note. When it comes to statistics, the number of people who visited the Provenance Research Project on the Met's website between January and October of this year is a little over 1,500 out of 57 million total visits to our website. Make a note of the spike at the end. A little over 1,500 out of 57 million means a shocking 0.00%. These are obviously shocking figures for those of us who are convinced of the importance of this work. American museums remain firmly committed to these provenance research projects, and this is commendable, given that today it might seem difficult to justify the time, effort, and expenditure in an era with the number of clicks or likes appear to determine what's important and what isn't. On the other hand, interestingly, for many visitors, the entry point to our website is the collection online. So I asked my IT colleagues whether they can quantify how many visitors do in fact open the provenance drawer for any given object, and I was told 8.2%. That's good news. Visitors come to our website because they are interested in the unique objects in our care, and they are interested in the intertwined lives of these objects and their owners, as shown by the spike of interest coinciding with our new web feature and blog series. We just need to reach out. Thank you.
Ich möchte Ihnen jetzt Rüdiger Marlow vorstellen,
I would now like to introduce Rüdiger Marlow, who in his presentation is also going to make the consequences of Washington clear and make some suggestions as to what might happen in the future. Rüdiger Marlow studied law and had a Master of Business Administration, which he obtained in the United States. He worked in executive functions in a variety of international companies and also volunteered with Jewish organizations, including the Jewish community in Berlin. Since 2014, he has been a representative of the JCC, the Jewish Claims Conference, Jewish Conference of Material Claims in Germany, headquartered in Frankfurt with a branch in Berlin. I would like Mr. Marlow to come on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizing teams, the different sponsors for this conference and for asking me to speak to you all. The NS theft of art was an integral and planned part of the Holocaust. Exploiting the Jewish population under the Third Reich in occupied and allied territories of other countries were all part of the program of Aryanization, of taking assets of whatever kind, insurance policies, furniture, property in kind and in cash, and including art. The material exploitation was followed by exploiting their labor. Then it was followed by annihilation and even of the economic utilization of hair, gold teeth, down to selling the ashes of those they burned as fertilizer. The idea was to extinguish all memory of European Jewry. Stealing art owned by Jews served to do more than finance the war of annihilation that Germany instigated. It had another important meaning as well. Artworks owned by a family have a high emotional value and create identity for a family. Works of art express the aesthetic feeling of the purchasers, collectors, and the people who have lived with these objects in their private households. Losing individual objets d'art or whole collections is something which over generations will be a painful gap in the family's memory and will be descending through the branches of the family as such. It is even more difficult if the loss was incurred as a part of Nazi theft or enforced sale or because there was the immigration of family members or because it was flight assets. Very often such a work of art is the only item belonging to the family which has survived the Holocaust. And that is why NS looted art is something for which the victims are particularly receptive. It is very important to them. It is family remembrance turned into an object. It has become part of the family's identity. And that is why there is so much attention given to this by various recipients and by the media. When we're talking about losing art and cultural heritage items for private individuals, also holds true for the loss of such objects owned by the general public. That threads its way through the whole history of collections. The theft of artworks is something which, both on the sides of the thieves and the sides of those who were robbed, has always caused particular intended effects: triumph, enrichment, and a sense of superiority on one side, losing a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of humiliation on the other side. Robbing artworks which are of national importance is something which has become part of the collective memory and a burden to the relationship between nations. The Germans are aware of this too. The theft of the Quadriga horse-drawn carriage on top of the Brandenburg Gate, or the Primus taken as looted art to the Soviet Union as it then was, this is something which are deeply anchored over generations in the collective memory of Germans. This is also something which happened in the year 70 AD when the Romans plundered the Jerusalem temple. It became a historical trauma for the Jewish people. Margaret Krinkenstein, in her speech on the occasion of the inauguration of the German Lost Arts Foundation, used the Battle of Grunewald painting to explain the importance which a work of art can have for collective memory and for the national identity of a people. The painting, the Battle of Grunewald, which took place in 1878, painter was Jan Matejko. The subject was the German Crusader orders, the Teutonic Knights losing a battle against the Lithuanians in 1410. Which is also a work of art which gave the Polish nation identity, something which the German occupiers in the Second World War also recognized, which is why they did all they could in order to obtain this particular painting, with the objective of weakening that sense of national identity in Poland. Now, the Poles, on their part, did everything they could to make sure that this work of art did not fall into enemy hands. They were able to bury it carefully and save it until the end of the war, and today it is in the Warsaw National Museum. Just as this particular painting was of the utmost importance for Polish national identity, the families decimated, persecuted by the Nazis also rate the one item of art which remains to them is of overriding importance for their own identity and that of their family. The National Socialist will to annihilate did not just aim at the physical destruction of Jews, but also aimed to destroy their very identity. Nobody should be able to find out who they were. That is why an inmate at Auschwitz was reduced to a number. No names anymore, just numbers. In Yad Vashem, even today, people are working on lifting 1.1 million Jews from the anonymity of just being called victims and having their names and thereby their identities returned to them. A mammoth task. Even more than 70 years after the end of the war, that job is not done. The same is true for all those objects which were found in digs around camps like Treblinka. Attempts are made to assign items to individuals, to reconstruct people's fate, and to posthumously have victims regain their identity. But why are we doing all this? For people who've been dead for over 70 years? We do it because for today's society, it gives identity, because that explains who we are, because it has a decisive impact on who we think we are. How we deal with yesterday impacts society today. Dealing with the Holocaust, and in general terms, the whole period 1933-1945 is a turning point, a pivot for our society, both for Jewish and German society. Societies move within a framework which is defined by an ideal state on the one hand, which is the sort of state that a society aspires to achieve, and the opposite, which is a state to which no society wishes to move. And the anti-ideal in Germany is the Shoah and National Socialism. And because we can always more easily agree on what you don't want than what you wish to have as society, this anti-ideal, with a few exceptions, is a consensus in this country. The German Basic Law, i.e. the German Constitution, has created rules to make democracy robust in order to prevent any new dictatorship and the path towards a new genocide. Because of the role of the Wehrmacht in the Third Reich, the new Bundeswehr has the principle of soldiers being citizens in uniform, which means that soldiers have to keep to human rights and cannot say, in whatever situation they find themselves, I followed orders. Individual high-ranking politicians, such as Heiko Maas, actually derive their political motivation for political activity to Auschwitz, or from Auschwitz rather. And that list could be extended ad nauseum. The Nazi period, the Holocaust, as a point of reference, also served to explain why authoritarian Germany today is a strong democracy. So that point of reference is very much part of German identity and Germany's raison d'etre. As a result, the restitution of stolen art is not something which is done simply for moral considerations or thoughts of conveying justice, but also because it provides identity for the Federal Republic of Germany. Any restitution, any fair and just solution will interrupt the NS injustice which had been ongoing, and it is another item of the free and liberal system of this country. Immanuel Kant said of a penal code, the negation of the negation. The restitution of stolen art means that you negate the legal and de facto state which has existed since the persecution-related confiscation of art. With this, we stand up against NS injustice, while at the same time enhancing the democratic stability of this country. Let us not kid ourselves. After 1945, Germans didn't become Democrats overnight. 1945 was not 0 hour. People didn't simply put their attitudes away like an old coat. 0 hour refers to the opportunity of creating a new social order. It was when people started to build a democracy based on the rule of law. And yet, that is a process one has to go through, which entails a lot of social tension, struggles, so that eventually the result is democracy. And the same is true for looted art. That too is a process. And in 1998, with the signatures to the Washington Principles, this process commenced. But it had to get into people's hearts and minds first. The Washington Principles, and Mr. Eisenstadt, one of the founding fathers, is with us today, and yesterday he gave us a valuable contribution to our conference. That was a beginning. From that beginning in Germany, hands were stretched out. The Advisory Commission was established, and the German Lost Arts Foundation was created as well. All of these were the right steps to take, but there are still gaps in how we deal with NS looted art, or some things haven't even been tackled at all. What I have in mind is looted art in private hands, or the systematic screening of museum stocks for looted art, which only about 1/3 of museums has started so far. Or I'm thinking of the question of airless looted art, and many issues like that. But one thing is clear, 20 years after the Washington Declaration, it is time to create an all-encompassing structure that regulates all unresolved issues. Let's start doing it and remember the victims in the name of both our and of German identity. Because in the future, we will have to answer the question as to whether, when it comes to NS looted art, we've done everything in our power, or whether we neglected to do some of the obvious things. And in this respect, let me make you aware of one particular point. Yesterday, we frequently talked about the federalist issue in connection with Nazi stolen art. Many speakers addressed it. The minister explained that she lacks the competence to do things because cultural affairs are governed by the German states, the Länder. So I would suggest that as far as looted art is concerned, in the Jewish context, that should be given to the federal level. In the end of the 1950s, a Jewish claimant could use restitution acts of the federal government to demand his or her property back. Why can't that be done today? Why was it possible in the 50s to say this was in the jurisdiction of the federal government, but not today? Why is the protection of German cultural heritage from going abroad something which the federal level is tackling, while fair and just solutions for looted art is not? So-called compensation and restitution, where we try to compensate for NS looted art, that is something which is in the interest of all Germany and should therefore be handled by the federal level, and I think that is definitely something which should be thought of once again. Let me go round another issue which is quite important to me. Whenever we discuss fair and just solutions, purely intuitively, we mean balancing the interests of two parties. To find a fair solution, both should meet halfway. So fair means halfway. So one party wants to get something back, the other party wants to keep something. Sounds like any normal legal settlement issue. But as Mr. Weber of the Looted Art Commission once said, fair and just solution, fine, but fair and just for whom? And this is where we have to take the historical context into consideration. It is my impression that with some arguments, this historical context is not considered. The restitution of a looted artwork is decided, and if that decision hinges on which side has the higher emotional relationship with that artwork, then you decide without taking into consideration the historical context. If the argument is that the stolen work of art is sufficiently important for the wider public, that this interest outweighs the interest of the victim, then you have left the historical context out of consideration. If restitution of stolen art and cultural heritage item is something for which both sides have to pay, you haven't taken the historical context sufficiently into consideration. This balancing of interest act is treated as if it's a purely private law matter, while we're forgetting the previous criminal acts, which meant that one side now has a work of art while the other has not. The absolute wish to annihilate was behind the Nazi looting and spoiling of Jewish facilities, synagogues. The attempt was to destroy Jewish life and Jewish facilities in Europe and worldwide forever. Apart from trying to gain precious metals in order to obtain foreign currency, melting down Jewish ritual objects served that very purpose. Very few of those objects survived the Nazi period and could be saved. In the majority of cases, provenance could not be resolved, so no restitution was possible. Particularly cult objects which serve to exercise religion are eminently cultural tradition maintenance carriers. And in the case of jewelry, it is something which looks back to a centuries-old tradition, and the Jewish culture has been transported by those objects through centuries. With the Handbook of Judaica, the Claims Conference would like to make a contribution to remember the loss and decline of Jewish culture as a result of Nazi acts and to find ways out. We are grateful that currently the Ministry for Culture and the Media is helping us to provide a German issue. The National Socialist art theft is something which needs to be explored as part of the Holocaust and to document it. That is memory work. Systematic provenance research will contribute to making sure that Jewish National Socialism collections can be reconstructed and at least virtually revitalized. Provenance research about NS looted art gives us an insight into the original owners, their aesthetic preferences, which goes beyond the object but shows us a larger context of collections and the whole purchase history. Apart from ritualized remembrance, which has its own important job, we should only remember the International Holocaust Memorial Day or 9 November, the Night of Broken Glass, with its different facets of remembrance. We should also start to consider this remembrance something which should be part and parcel of everyday life. And everyday life, in case of stolen art by the Nazis, means that provenance researchers, museum directors, and everybody who curates exhibitions must be aware that through their work they can contribute to creating greater transparency into what happened in history and thereby contribute to a more just solution in the present. So provenance research is not just an add-on, a supplementary branch, but a proper research discipline which can also provide specific exhibition projects, give us detailed information on individual exhibits, and can also provide thematic guides through exhibitions, thereby opening up wider context. Last but not least, provenance research also always gives us an insight into what happened to the original owner, his or her family, the way rights were removed, people were removed, and maybe even help them to get their stolen property back. Sometimes even the methods employed can be made clear. So we can say without reservation that provenance research makes an important contribution to remembrance work. In this context, I would like the Jewish Digital Cultural Recovery Project, which we've already heard about, and Agnes Perestege and Mr. Fischer would have spoken about it. That is one of these projects that does a great deal towards remembrance work, partly through means of provenance research. The task which is Sodas is unique. They use perpetrator files and try to analyze in their entirety Jewish collections and to make them available online in a very holistic way, comprehensively. That just does more than simply show what was, what is, but also what was lost. It's a fantastic contemporary way of remembrance which has a very wide reach and encompasses manifold aspects. Very important prerequisites for remembrance work is the sourcing and publishing of documents that prove what happened historically, like paintings, artworks, facts. All of these things and artifacts need to be saved for us, not just in order to show them to people who like to decry what happened, but also to work with them, in particular when it comes to understanding what historical methods and processes were, to look at one object and draw conclusions for the general idea from them, and vice versa. Even today, archivists are necessary for our pedagogical work as well. And in the near future, once the last survivors will no longer be with us, they will help us provide silent but vehement witnesses of this genocide. This information is something where we see the survivors of the Shoah have made a global contribution by providing an emotional access to the Holocaust for many succeeding generations. Once they are deceased, the question is, who will take this emotional part? Various concepts are being developed, partly with the use of state-of-the-art technologies. For example, in some American museums, they already have digital witnesses, life-size, standing in front of you, answering your questions. Thereby, a communication can be established between the worlds of yesterday and now. I think this is going to be one of the many projects which will help carry this memory into the next generation. In order to be able to remember, the documents that Provenance research works with need to be analyzed, digitized, and published, particularly wood-coated paper with high wood content from the 1930s, 40s, and the immediate post-war period would otherwise run the danger of being irretrievably lost. And in many cases, urgent action is needed. For example, when it comes to some of the files of the higher regional financial court in Berlin and Brandenburg, which are housed in the Brandenburg State Archives, they document the systematic robbing of the Jewish population and the dreadful methods employed by the German financial authorities, and they do so with amazing thoroughness. And often that gives us hints as to where some of the looted objects are. There are more than 2 million individual sheets of paper we're talking about, which have been put together into more than 400,000 individual files. And the same is true for some other sets of files, which are very important and often the first point of contact for many of our provenance researchers, because they document in detail the efforts made by survivors, victims' families, and their descendants, and how to get back what they lost. And there are lists of their assets, including cultural and artistic items. And these are lists which the victims use to claim for loss of property. As far as I'm aware, the German federal government has recently approved the digitization and thereby the safekeeping of these documents. These are important archives for knowledge, and if need be, these will be made available for a more broadly based use in the future. Up to the Washington Conference held in 1998, and even in the first decade immediately after that conference, the theft of art and cultural items was a matter which played a very important role when it came to restitution of Jewish property. It was still individual damage incurred. For example, we talked about compensation given to victim groups of people in Eastern Europe, so far excluded from that, or the former forced laborers and slaves who also received compensation. That was at the foreground of things, in particular because of the extremely emotionally laden discussions about restitution, about works of art which were valuable nationally, Kirch's Street Scene or Klimt's Adel. That, again, redirected our attention to looted art. It was only with the Declaration of Washington that the victims found a basis for which they could try to obtain a fair and just solution in order to get the artworks which their family owned returned to them. Allow me to briefly say at this point that restitution comes from the Latin restituere, and it means restore. Unlike with damage to people's life, limb, freedom, in order to stick to the normal damages jargon in insurance, that sort of damage can always be restored, compensated for, because if you return something, you can restore the original state. But if you pay compensation, that restoration is to some extent restricted because you don't get back exactly what you had. You get a material compensation, a payment, which can only ever be a substitute. Such substitution acts, which we know from many cases where settlements were achieved, and often they do not lastingly satisfy claims. In the case of restitution, we're talking about repayment of a compensation which is due, and normally the amounts agreed on reveal the huge gap between the market value of the work of art in question and the claim. Even the whole history, restitution for any injustice, the disappointment, the lack of justice and the gaps in the system should therefore be commented on. When we're talking about Nazi stolen art these days, we have in mind high-ranking objects worthy of being housed in museums, important in the history of arts. Tens of thousands of these objects are still considered to be lost. If in the hopefully not all too distant futures public collections will have been screened properly, we will have to ask, what about the others? The others means stolen Jewish artifacts, cultural items owned by private citizens. This is still like a black box, or perhaps I should say like Pandora's box. The Schwabing find made clear that it's a very convoluted system of artworks of rather dubious origin, which have simply been handed over to heirs when one generation died off. The Schwabing find, because of its specific circumstances, would have been extraordinary, but in its core is more widespread. Let me also remind you of the modest items of art, culture, decoration, which were also taken away from Jewish households, and they're millions, and then auctioned off at basement bargain prices. Germans bought them for next to nothing, and without leaving a trace, these objects became part and parcel of other people's private households. Roman Kent, the doyen of American Holocaust survivors, once described it as follows: even we had our Mona Lisa. Our Mona Lisa was my mother's portrait. And in the mid-1930s, that painting had been commissioned by my father. Nobody knows where our Mona Lisa went. Remembering historical injustice is not something which can be restricted to the public sphere. This is also necessary in individual and private areas. We need to remember that the German civil society knowingly and happily profited from the Holocaust. A memory of when and how inherited furniture, objects, objets d'art or others became part of our households is important. It may be a painful memory, but it is honest, it is liberating, and it helps us look ahead. Thank you for your attention.
So now we're going to use this opportunity to take any questions or maybe to have a brief discussion. I'm afraid because of the lights, I can't actually see if somebody's waving and wanting to hear the floor, but maybe nobody wants to have the floor and ask questions. Is there someone there? No? Is there someone there? There is someone there. Ah, okay.
I'm Alfred Hammerstein, chairman of the Dutch Restitution Committee, and I want to make 3 remarks for the record. First, in the Netherlands we have an excellent provenance research staff embedded now in the National Institute that deals with World War history and the Holocaust. And second, the Dutch Restitution Committee follows the Washington principles and will do that in the future. So there is no reason to worry about that. And my third remark is that in the balance of interest, in all cases where we see a Nazi-related confiscation of art, the balance will always be in the favor of the claimant. I like to say that today because I heard some remarks otherwise. Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this conference.
Thank you. Okay.
This is to my Dutch colleague. I think that your country has been a model at the outset of following the Washington principles. Your definitions, the breadth of your research, the comprehensive nature of what you've attempted to do, the transparency of your commission. But I have to say that the recent, and it's very recent, introduction of the balance of interest is totally contrary to the Washington principles. It's not sufficient to say that where there's a confiscation, the balance will always be in the favor. The whole point is that just and fair solutions was not intended to focus on the interest of the museum in keeping collections. It was entirely to focus on the claimant's just solutions. That doesn't mean that when a case is brought that the claimant will always be able to prove sufficiently that there was a compensation due or a restitution due or that it was a forced sale. That's a factual situation. But as a matter of policy, respectfully, the balance that you've tried to make of the emotional attachment of the particular claimant to the importance of the museum keeping collection is completely contrary to our whole intention. And it's out of step with the tradition that the Dutch have had in the beginning of the whole process and really up until the last year or so. It's almost unfathomable where this came from. And I would really urge you in the strongest way to try to take a look at this and go back to where you were up to this point. What occasioned this new balance is very hard to say, but it was not the way in which you proceeded, and I would simply urge you to continue in the process that you had done so forcefully and been such a leader.
So, da hinten wartet noch jemand.
Thank you. We certainly hear the critics and take that seriously, but I don't want to discuss in this forum and on this moment of the day a singular case. So we disagree about that, and the discussion will go further. But I emphasize that we follow the Washington principles as good as possible.
Ja, da ist noch jemand.
And there's someone over there.
Yes, I would like to make just one remark for Mr. Hammerstein. In the year 2000, we had negotiations about the restitution in Holland, and in these negotiations that were held between the Jews community in Israel and in Holland and the Dutch government. At this stage, there is no communication between the Dutch Jewish communities and the art retrieval in Holland. And I would like to ask Mr. Hammerstein to receive our delegation. Today we talked with some people of your ministry to receive a delegation from us and to argue about all what is going on in respect of lost art and hairless art in Holland. Thank you.
Ja, ich wollte noch mal daran erinnern.
I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow there will be workshops. And yes, we'll take one last question, and then you will have an opportunity to discuss these issues in detail in the workshop. So we'll just take this last comment or question.
Thank you. My name is James Smallhout. I am the descendant of Dutch Holocaust victims. And I would like to clarify some of the points that have just been made here. There has always been a problem with restitution in the Netherlands, and it stems from a misguided legal philosophy which applies a doctrine of voluntary action to property losses, as though somehow Jewish persecutees had any say in the matter. And there are many cases, some involving property that my family lost, that were adjudicated against us for that very reason. So this is a long-standing problem in the Netherlands, despite many perceptions to the contrary.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Colette Avital to come up to the front and give her an opportunity to read the Jerusalem Declaration, hopefully quickly.
Thank you very much. And I first would like to thank the German Lost Art Foundation for 2 incredibly important days. And in the spirit of what has been discussed here today, and following a conference that we held in Jerusalem on the 4th of October, I would like to share with you the principal elements of the Jerusalem Declaration on the future of looted art. We did not devote much time to the past, but we really are looking to the next kind of solutions that can be envisaged, and I would hope that sharing this declaration with you, some of you might want to adopt it. I'm not going to read all of it, I'm going to read part of it, aware of the long time that has passed since the looting, aware of the difficulties in locating the heirs of the looted cultural treasures, aware of the difficulties in studying the provenance of objects which may be considered hairless, looted cultural assets, aware of the difficulties of the different legal procedures. We strongly believe that it is incumbent upon us to perpetuate the memory of the cultural life of the destroyed communities, of which the looted works of art and sacred objects are part. We consider that the public should be made aware of the history and circumstances of which the art was looted. Therefore, we, representatives of the State of Israel and the Jewish world, call upon the countries that endorsed the Washington Conference principles on Nazi-confiscated art and the Theresian Declaration to act vigorously to implement the aforementioned declarations, including taking steps expeditiously to achieve just and fair solutions for the return of the stolen art to its original owners or to their heirs, and just and fair solutions where owners or heirs of former Jewish owners, individuals or legal persons cannot be identified. Systematic provenance research of art and Judaica should be undertaken to allow the original owners and their heirs. To allow in the meantime unclaimed looted art, currently stored in museums to be temporarily loaned to and exhibited in museums in Israel and around the world. These works should be displayed with the appropriate explanations of the circumstances of their looting. We call upon all museums in the world that hold World War II hairless art collections to allocate space in their own halls and to exhibit such works of art accompanied by explanations of the looting. We urge countries and museums to make a firm commitment to take the appropriate legal steps to return the works of art that are so loaned for exhibitions to their rightful owners when claims for restitution are filed. We believe that this approach can help in education about and commemoration of the Holocaust and tell the story of the destruction of the cultural life of the Jewish people perpetrated by the Nazis. I do hope that this is something we can all adopt. Thank you very much.
So, wir wollen jetzt ein Fazit versuchen und
So now we want to conclude, and I'd like to invite Elena Landmann to come and speak to us, and she will draw a conclusion. She's from Switzerland, studied German studies, art history, and theater studies in Bern in Switzerland. And then she pursued a journalist career in a number of regional newspapers, and since 2002 she's been a freelance art critic. Since 2004 she's been an editor at the Swiss radio and TV SRF2 Culture, and she has focused a lot on reporting about art confiscated by the Nazis. Elena Landmann, you have the floor now.
Yes.
Ja, herzlichen Dank für die nette Einführung, Silly Kugelmann. Mein Dank gilt auch dem
Thank you very much for this kind introduction.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren.
Thank you also, ladies and gentlemen. This is my stock taking of an observation. Conclusions of an Observer is the title of my contribution to this conference, but I did not come up with this concise title because I knew in advance just how I would feel at the end of the second day at 17:15 to speak. To be honest, my head is swimming. So many points of view, so many problems, so many individual cases, and so much injustice. I'm not a provenance researcher, I'm a journalist. Throughout the day, we've heard some very apposite descriptions regarding the core competence of what I'm about. Good headlines, unacceptable shortages, stupid or burning questions. As a journalist, I will less take stock, but more point out unresolved issues and outline focal points that have really left their mark on this conference. 20 years after signing the Washington Principles here in Berlin, experts from all over the world are meeting. Museum directors, curators, politicians, researchers, heirs, successors of victims of the Holocaust, to take stock, to dare to look back, and to look at ways ahead for the future. Stock-taking and looking back, though, became clearly less of a problem. It was a problem, but the real issue is the difficult future. It's not just not clear where exactly we are going. What is also not clear is what exactly we mean by the future. 10 years? 20 years? One bid in the course of the conference was 50 years. Do I hear more? And what is supposed to be achieved? What actually is the roadmap? Are all the Nazi stolen arts items identified then? Shall they have been researched? Or is the wider definition about the fact that we're dealing with all losses due to persecution, shall they have been returned to all the legal heirs? Or shall they all have been given a fair and just solution, whatever that might exactly be? However diverse all these individual objectives may be, do you think it's at all possible? And let me emphasize, this question is not a rhetorical one, but it is a question that in the course of this conference we avoided. And that often is the most interesting thing, namely that which was not discussed. There are some other things we did not discuss, at least not much, at this conference. For example, how to rephrase the Washington principles to make them more apt. Katrin Stoll this morning demanded Washington Principles 2.0. Marcus Orofsky, in a brief role, said there should be a critical rephrasing of these principles. My question is, does it make sense to criticize the Washington Principle? Or are they the best thing we will have and ever could have? We also didn't talk much about how private archives of the art trade can be opened up for research. Ronald Lord of the World Jewish Congress pointed out they should be opened. And I know that Stuart Eisenstadt, Hermann Partzinger did the same thing. But how is this to happen? How will researchers obtain access to this important information? And the fact that all this information protection, data protection, is responsible for provenance gaps is something we all know. The fact private art archives still remain closed to research is a scandal. Is there no way of opening them up, and why aren't we discussing that? What we are happy to discuss is technology and databases and the promises of the digital age. I think is great. I'm all ears. But of course I'm asking myself, might we compensate a little for the fact that in other areas, like that of the private archives, we are not making any headway? And I'm asking myself, who is supposed to feed all this information into databases, and who will then analyze all that provenance information that will then be digitally available? Why are we talking so much about technology and so little about manpower? As I say, I wrote this sentence, coming sentence last night. It's no longer active. Sustainability of provenance research, the precarious conditions of employment, the many problems and requirements which come into being when we make provenance research a university academic study course. That was discussed today. We wait to continue this debate. Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt has made very clear that provenance research is the foundation stone of restitution, and yet the experts that do this job still have fixed-term contracts. Why is that? So that this so relevant work remains cheap? Or is the idea of getting rid of these provenance researchers you called as soon as you can afterwards? I keep the fact that we all agree that provenance research is a priority, a central issue for all we do in the future. It's not a surprise, to be honest. And I have never seen so many researchers, provenance researchers, all in one place as here. After 2 days, we also agree on another point. We need to do more. State Minister Monica Grütters and many other speakers have also pointed out in the course of this conference that what we've achieved so far is not sufficient. 20 years of the Washington Principles, that does not mark an end, but a beginning. Still, too many heirs are waiting for their legal property. Too many museums still have too many objects with unresolved provenance, not even to mention the private collectors. How to remedy this situation? Yeah, research, sure, and fair and just solutions. And that raises another of the underlying controversies of the conference. What exactly do we mean with these oft-quoted just and fair solutions? Wesley Fisher, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, openly asked just and fair for whom? Who benefits if we strive for just and fair solutions? Is it the descendants, the heirs, or rather the institutions, museums, and governments? It's interesting to observe that even at this conference, people emphasize that restitution does not exclusively, not only, quote-unquote, mean the return of objects, but who has an interest in the fact that this does not constitute just return? When we're dealing with looted art, aren't we talking about returning property, i.e. making justice work? To return property is a central issue for the report that Bénédicte Savoy and Felwine Sarr have just written about how to deal with colonial looted art in France. And sadly here, that was not an issue.
The just and fair solutions compellingly proposed by the Washington Principles was also highlighted by Colette Avital of the Center Organization of Holocaust Survivors in Israel, which she did in a critical way. She also suggested a regular approach to make sure that return can happen. Tony Baumgartner of the Spoliation Advisory Panel pointed out that there should be more in the supranational scale of the Nazi stolen art issue. We should also need a supranational legal answer to it. The fact that claimants, the descendants of injured parties, are subject to a variety of different legal systems in Europe is not tenable. And Lucian Simmons from Sotheby's, though, he pointed out that laws, whether national or supranational laws, might well be completely superfluous because the interest of the market is oriented to moral goodness, i.e. objects with resolved provenance. Well, we can be glad that at the moment the market is so morally minded. It wasn't always. I know that. I'm from Switzerland. Apart from the controversy in the course of the conference, it also became clear that the question of deficits, what didn't go so well in these 20 years, however simple it may be, is a very difficult one depending on your point of view. Christoph Basel of the Austrian Chancellery turned a variety of impressive verbal twists in order not to mention deficits, but to speak instead about what has been achieved. And Wolf Tegeldorf of the Limbach Commission was extremely cautious and several times announced he would have to be very cautious. Now, I could easily spend another 10 minutes reading from my minutes, but I would like to end by giving you two proposals from this conference which I consider to be important. Number one is the announcement by Monika Grütter saying that the Limbach Commission might in the future be applied to unilaterally. That's interesting. If claimants want to apply it to the Commission, the federal museums would have to cooperate. Equally interesting as this plan was what also Minister Grütter announced, namely what would happen if the federal museums would not cooperate, because she announced that sanctions could be levied, like cutting the budget of the museums involved. Sanctions. One of these terms which was hardly mentioned in the 2 days of this conference. The Washington Principles, whose historical importance we commemorated with this meeting, these Washington Principles do not allow for sanctions. Remarkable. Of course, you know it. But isn't it interesting that at this meeting, which is supposed to help us draw out a roadmap for the future, sanctions were hardly mentioned at all. The second proposal I would like to remind you of was made by Agnes Perez-Tegi of the Commission of Art Recovery. She suggested that claimants and the museums concerned should jointly decide for a researcher who would then study provenance. So instead of keeping it a unilateral process, the idea is to turn it into a joint process and to build up trust in the process. And finally, one more thing. Stories. The strength of storytelling, the strength these stories have and release was made very clear, very impressively by Edmund de Waal. But all these stories about the descendants, and as we heard yesterday, thank you for being so open. I've heard a lot from you. I've heard that some of you waive the right to lawyers while others appreciate their help. I've seen Siegfried Lemne in a silent movie swinging his cane, and I've heard about Marcus Heinemann's dispersed and widespread family. Becky Korn-Vargas reported how 40 relations finally met in all places in Lüneburg. Family reunion. That, the granddaughter said, was the strength of provenance research. These reports were very moving, and once again, many thanks to the descendants for coming to Berlin. And yet, I think something was missing, namely the stories of those descendants who were not successful, who weren't contacted by a provenance researcher in some small museum. People who are still, and in vain, looking for those objects that were stolen from their ancestors. People who don't have Edmund de Waal's almost transcendental practical art, but who, in inverted commas, just fail to push forward their claims. Their stories may not be such a nice story to tell on this anniversary, at this anniversary of Washington Principles, but I think they would have been just as illustrative. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now, before I give the final word to Professor Lupfers, I wanted to thank you and the German Lost Art Foundation for organizing this amazing conference here. It took months of preparation to get all this together, and I think we've had some very fruitful discussions. It was an awful lot of work that you took on to make this happen, and your work isn't over. Let me remind you that tomorrow there are workshops where you'll have the opportunity to discuss these issues in more detail. So now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Lupfer. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you for being here so long. This isn't going to be the last word, because the last word isn't what we want. We've heard an awful lot. A lot has been said. A last word sounds as if the conference is over, and as Ms. Kugelmann already said, it is not. So let me emphasize this once again, that it's a 3-day event, so you need to also include the workshops. They won't happen here in this room. They'll be one level down, so bear these in mind. And I think these workshops will be very interesting and productive. When I began this conference, when I started it yesterday, I talked about argumentative controversies that I was hoping to have. We have had those, and I'm very grateful that we've had those. It's important that our disputes didn't lose sight of the fact that we're trying to achieve a common goal. I think this is something that we explicitly have to say is a very good thing in this conference. Now, before I do try to come to a sort of minimal summing up, allow me to say thank you, first of all, to all of the colleagues from the German Lost Art Foundation, which, as we just heard from Ms. Kugelmann, did indeed have a huge challenge to put this conference on. We're not a huge conference. We're not a huge organization. It really did take us months to organize this conference and prepare it. But I also want to say thank you to our partners, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and the Cultural Foundation of the German Federal States, who supported us. I also want to say thank you to the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and the Media for making it possible by funding it. Thank you as well to the House of World Cultures that hosted us and their staff for making that all possible. I also want to thank the interpreters. They've been thanked a number of times, but I think we need to thank them and thank everyone else who were the hostesses and organized this smooth running of this conference. I think it's quite astounding when you have a big conference like this without any major technical cock-ups, for example. So that was great. Thanks to all of the speakers, some of whom have traveled a very long way to be here. I'm just seeing the Magis here in the front row, but they're representative of so many others who've come a very long way. Some have traveled a very long distance, taken a lot of time to prepare their talks as well. So thank you. Thank you also to the 2 women who chaired us through these last few days. It wasn't easy to try to get us to stick to the time allocated to us, and we didn't always do it, but you wanted to sometimes leave space and sometimes not. So well done for negotiating that challenge. I think the easiest conclusion that I could draw that's been said a few times, not least from Ms. Landmann, who said it very well, is some things, not everything, some things, and there will be different views, and that's fine. some things have been achieved. Sometimes we might say many things have been achieved, but there's still a great deal that needs to be done. We haven't reached the end at all. We're somewhere in the middle. Ms. Landmann put the question of how long this might go on. 5, 10, 15, 25, 50 years? I don't want to speculate how long we'll be doing this. We have got a clear aim, and it's been formulated on a number of occasions, and it's going to take us a while to get there. And if anybody's hoping we might be done in 3 years and say, right, we've looked through absolutely everything and we've sorted it, that's not going to happen. No way. However, the fact that it could take a long time must not be taken as an excuse to think, right, well, then we don't have to do so much. We could tackle the whole thing more slowly. Quite the opposite is the case. I think in the years to come, we need to increase and intensify our efforts. I hope we are on the right path to doing this. For many of the talks that I've had, the statements that we've heard, written documents we have received, I would just like to say, just to add 1 or 2 things for today, just a very, very brief sort of summing up of some of the most important points, steps that we need to take moving forward. Museum organizations, archive organizations, and when I say the organizations, it's not just the museums and also libraries and archives, but also the funding principles have to be involved in the responsibility, and they have to do justice to their responsibility to continue to implement the Washington principles and do so more than they have so far, and the common declaration that was made as well, to ensure the provenance researchers can do their work in the long term and to ensure a certain sustainability there. The funding organizations of institutions that preserve public cultural assets need to create permanent positions. We have heard this with or without green buttons throughout the conference. So it's not just about job creation for provenance researchers. It's about bringing a certain permanence into the structures of their work. Institutions that preserve cultural assets should put their entire collections online, digitally, to the furthest extent possible. They need to create transparency by making them accessible for everyone on the websites of these institutions. Obviously, this is a huge effort for museums and libraries and archives. Digitization doesn't happen at the press of a button, even if we sometimes think it does. And this needs to be a footnote to what I've just said, and therefore this postulate or wish, again, to the funding organizations that fund these organizations is that they free up the funding to make this happen. And from this perspective, let's look at another. Potential claimants or applicants, whatever you want to call it, descendants of people who have been dispossessed of their artworks or other artifacts should be supported until they manage to achieve a fair and just solution. The institutions that preserve cultural assets, on the other hand, when it comes to searching for the rightful owners or their descendants and heirs, should get the support they need to simplify this process and make it happen faster. And networking and connecting the institutions that are involved with provenance research, including their databases in the individual countries, as we've heard many times, need to be developed further. And Ms. Landmann quite rightly touched on the fact that it's important and necessary and meaningful to talk about digitization, but that digitization isn't a panacea. Who's going to operate these databases and bring it all together? Best practice examples should be communicated and compiled nationally and internationally, and perhaps not so central, but there needs to be a unified technology, terminology rather. At least we should aspire to this. Now another level, and I would link on to Colette Avital as well, and to the panel yesterday with Wesley Fisher and others, for artifacts where we cannot currently and may not be able to anytime soon close provenance gaps. We ought to look for fair and just solutions within the context of the Washington Principles as well. And a statistic of all measures and identifying artifacts confiscated by the Nazis, seeking and achieving just and fair solutions and cases of restitution should be regularly published so that we know what's been done in this area. Artifacts that have been clearly identified but not yet claimed for, but are clearly cases of artifacts confiscated by the Nazis, should not stay in public or private ownership. The particular role of these artifacts in the history of the Shoah should be done justice to. Existing mediation bodies and their negotiations trying to find fair and just solutions quickly should be developed further, made more effective. And young academics in the area of provenance research should be fostered even more than they are now, not just as an end in itself or an academic course and training process, but with a specific aim, namely to achieve fair and just solutions. The confiscation of art by the Nazis needs to be documented more and researched more, and findings should be communicated widely to pass this knowledge on to the next generation and ensure that it happens. Rüdiger Malo just emphasized this, and I would agree with him that museums, libraries, and all other preservers of cultural assets and educational institutions as well, primarily educational institutions, should address the issue of art stolen by the Nazis in their curricula. We have heard some good, convincing initial examples, but this is a process that has begun in recent years and needs to continue. The moral commitment in the Washington Principles is one that should cover private collectors and the art trade. We would like to see them accept this. This is one of the key issues that is still open in this conference, and Ms. Landmann was quite right in touching on this, that we need responses as to how this can happen in specific terms. We don't have these responses yet, at least not convincing ones, but clearly this is a big issue for recent years, and we need to think about all of the instruments that we have at our disposal, not just in Germany, but also in Germany. We need to look at this issue, and this has come up very clearly. We also need to look here and elsewhere to the extent to which and where the issue of the Washington Principles requires legislation to support and guarantee that the Washington Principles prevail. And also we need to say that the progress made in implementing the Washington Principles will hopefully continue to unfold successfully in the future. And perhaps we need to meet regularly, not maybe every 10 years, but we should have international conferences to look at how we are doing with the Washington Principles. So this isn't a final statement, but rather just an interim summary of what still needs to be done in this important challenge that we are all taking on and we are all aiming for. I want to thank all of you for your attention, and I want to thank you for your commitment in the last 2 days. I very much hope, above and beyond the plenary, that there has been a lot of, well, I think there has been a lot of talks during the breaks, and I think that we are inspired but also concerned by all that still remains to be done. I think some of you will be here tomorrow for the workshops. I hope to see you there. And otherwise, I wish you a good evening. And if you are traveling home, a good trip home. Thank you.